In the winter of 1847, the St. Catherine's Hospital for the Afflicted in western Pennsylvania closed its doors forever. The official records state that 156 patients died within its walls over 8 years of operation, but not a single soul was ever recorded as being cured or discharged alive. What the church authorities buried in their archives was far more disturbing than mere medical incompetence. Local residents whispered about the screams that echoed through the valley on moonless nights, about the strange processions of robed figures carrying bundles toward the hospital's basement, and about the peculiar fact that no family member was ever permitted to visit their dying relatives. The Catholic Diocese of Pittsburgh sealed all records in 1848, and for nearly 2 centuries the truth remained hidden beneath layers of ecclesiastical silence and fear. Before we continue with the story of St. Catherine's Hospital, this channel isn't for everyone, only for the bravest souls who dare to uncover the darkest secrets hidden by religious institutions. If you're one of those true mystery seekers who refuses to look away from the uncomfortable truths of history, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Drop a comment below telling us what state or city you're listening from. Our community of mystery hunters spans the globe, and we want to know where you're brave enough to face these stories. Now, let's descend into the horrifying reality of what really happened behind those stone walls. The events that would haunt the coal mining region of Westmoreland County began in the autumn of 1839, when the Catholic Church purchased a sprawling estate overlooking the Loyalhanna Creek. The rolling hills of western Pennsylvania in 1839 were scarred by the relentless expansion of coal mining operations. German and Irish immigrants had flooded into the region, drawn by promises of steady work in the mines and mills that dotted the landscape like industrial wounds. The small town of Bradenville, with its population of barely 800 souls, had grown rapidly around the mining operations, transforming from a quiet farming community into a bustling industrial outpost in less than a decade. With growth came suffering on an unprecedented scale. Mine accidents were not just common, they were expected. Cave-ins, explosions, and the slow death of black lung disease claimed lives regularly, leaving behind widows and orphans who struggled to survive on the meager compensation offered by the mining companies. The nearest hospital was a grueling 2-day journey to Pittsburgh, often too far for the critically injured who bled out or succumbed to their injuries long before they could reach proper medical care. The local doctor, an elderly German immigrant named Dr. Ernst Schultz, was overwhelmed by the sheer volume of suffering in the community. His small practice, located above the town's general store, was equipped to handle minor injuries and common ailments, but the industrial accidents and occupational diseases that plagued the mining community were beyond his capabilities. Dr. Schultz had been pleading with the Catholic Diocese for years to establish some kind of medical facility in the region, knowing that his aging hands and limited resources were insufficient to serve the growing population. It was against this backdrop of industrial desperation and medical inadequacy that Father Heinrich Bergmann arrived from Bavaria in the autumn of 1839. The timing seemed almost providential to the struggling community. Father Bergmann was not an ordinary priest. He was a man of apparent wealth and education, carrying with him impressive credentials from the University of Munich and letters of recommendation from high-ranking Catholic officials across Europe. More importantly, he claimed to possess knowledge of revolutionary medical treatments that combined the latest advances in European medicine with what he called spiritual healing methodologies. Father Bergmann was a striking figure who commanded attention wherever he went. Tall and gaunt, with piercing gray eyes that seemed to look through rather than at the people he spoke with, he possessed an unnaturally pale complexion that made him appear almost ethereal. His voice carried a cultured German accent that lent authority to his words, and his manner of speaking was both hypnotic and unsettling. When he spoke of his medical training and his divine calling to serve the suffering masses of America's industrial frontier, even the most skeptical listeners found themselves drawn to his vision. The local Catholic community, predominantly German immigrants who had settled in the region during the 1830s, welcomed Father Bergmann with the desperate hope of drowning men grasping for salvation. Father Johann Kessler, the elderly priest who had been struggling to minister to the rapidly growing and increasingly desperate population, saw in Bergmann what he believed to be divine providence. The younger priest's apparent medical knowledge, his obvious wealth. He had purchased the largest and most expensive estate in the county with cash, and his sophisticated understanding of both religious and secular matters seemed like the answer to years of prayers. The estate that Father Bergmann purchased was itself a source of local fascination and unease. Known as the Thornwood Manor, it had been built in the 1820s by a wealthy coal baron who had abandoned it after a series of family tragedies left him bankrupt and broken. The property consisted of over 300 acres of rolling hills and dense forest, with the main house positioned on a prominent hill that overlooked the entire valley. The house itself was an imposing three-story structure built from local limestone, with thick walls and narrow windows that gave it an almost fortress-like appearance. Local residents had always found the property unsettling. The previous owner's children had died under mysterious circumstances. Some said from a fever that swept through the house. Others whispered about accidents that seemed too numerous and too convenient to be coincidental. The coal baron himself had become increasingly reclusive in his final years, rarely leaving the property and speaking to neighbors about strange sounds and unexplained phenomena that plagued the estate. When he finally abandoned the property, he had told anyone who would listen that the land was cursed by God himself, and that no good would ever come to anyone who tried to make their home there. Father Bergmann, however, seemed entirely unconcerned by the property's dark reputation. He spoke enthusiastically about the isolation and privacy that the estate would provide for his medical work, explaining that his revolutionary treatments required absolute quiet and freedom from the distractions and superstitions of town life. The distance from Bradenville, nearly 5 miles of winding dirt road that became treacherous during rain or snow, was not a disadvantage, he claimed, but a necessity for the type of intensive healing work he intended to perform. St. Catherine's Hospital for the Afflicted was constructed with remarkable speed and an attention to detail that impressed even the most skilled craftsmen in the area. Father Bergmann had hired workers from across the region, paying wages that were significantly higher than the standard rate and insisting on the highest quality materials and workmanship. Local craftsmen, many of them German immigrants who were grateful for the well-paid work, labored through the harsh winter of 1839-1840 to complete the imposing structure according to Father Bergmann's precise specifications. The hospital's design was unlike anything the local workers had seen before. While it was ostensibly a medical facility, the building's architecture seemed to draw inspiration from European monasteries and fortresses rather than hospitals. The walls were constructed from massive blocks of local limestone, giving the structure an appearance of permanence and strength that seemed designed to withstand siege rather than simply house patients. The windows were narrow and positioned high on the walls, limiting the amount of natural light that could enter the building while making it difficult for anyone inside to see out or for outsiders to see in. Most unusual of all was Father Bergmann's insistence on an extensive basement level that extended far deeper into the hillside than seemed necessary for any conventional purpose. The priest explained that these underground chambers were essential for his specialized treatments, which required precise temperature and humidity control that could only be achieved by building into the earth itself. The basement excavation required additional stonework and reinforcement that added months to the construction timeline and significantly increased the project's cost. But Father Bergmann seemed to have unlimited financial resources to draw upon. The interior of the hospital was equally distinctive. The main floor housed what appeared to be conventional medical facilities, examination rooms, a small surgery, and quarters for medical staff. The second floor contained patient rooms that were spartanly furnished, but clean and well ventilated. It was the third floor and basement level that set St. Catherine's apart from any other medical facility in the region. The third floor was divided into chambers that Father Bergmann described as spiritual healing rooms, equipped with religious artifacts and symbols that he claimed were essential to his treatment methodology. The basement level remained off-limits to the construction workers, with Father Bergmann and a small group of assistants who had arrived with him from Europe handling all work in those underground chambers personally. Throughout the construction process, Father Bergmann displayed an encyclopedic knowledge of both medical and religious matters that impressed everyone who worked with him. He could discuss the latest developments in European medicine with the same authority that he brought to theological discussions, and his library, which filled an entire room in the hospital, contained texts in multiple languages covering subjects ranging from anatomy and surgery to religious mysticism and ancient history. Local residents who visited the construction site came away convinced that they were witnessing the creation of something truly revolutionary. A medical facility that would bring the most advanced healing methods in the world to their struggling community. The hospital's first patient, Sarah Catherine Hoffman, arrived on a cold March morning in 1840, just days after the facility's official opening. Sarah was a 23-year-old woman who had been coughing blood for months, her condition steadily worsening despite the folk remedies and constant prayers of the local community. Her husband Klaus was a coal miner who had saved every penny of his modest wages for months to afford what he hoped would be life-saving treatment for his beloved wife. Klaus Hoffmann was a man who had learned to be suspicious of promises that seemed too good to be true. His years in the mines had taught him that life was hard and that most offers of easy solutions came with hidden costs. But as he watched his wife growing weaker each day, as he saw the blood on her handkerchief becoming more frequent and more abundant, his desperation overcame his natural caution. When Father Bergmann personally assured him that Sarah would receive the finest medical care available anywhere in America, that the hospital's revolutionary treatments would restore her health completely, Klaus allowed hope to override his instincts. The process of admitting Sarah to the hospital was unlike anything Klaus had experienced. Rather than the simple paperwork and basic medical examination he had expected, Father Bergmann conducted what he called a comprehensive spiritual and physical assessment that lasted for several hours. The priest questioned Sarah extensively about her family history, her religious beliefs, her dreams and fears, and a variety of other topics that seemed unrelated to her medical condition. He examined her not just physically, but seemed to be evaluating her responses to various religious symbols and texts, noting her reactions in a leather-bound journal that he kept locked in a small chest. Most unsettling to Klaus was Father Bergmann's explanation of the hospital's treatment philosophy. The priest spoke at length about the interconnected nature of physical and spiritual health, explaining that true healing could only be achieved by addressing both the material and metaphysical aspects of illness. Sarah's consumption, he claimed, was not simply a disease of the lungs, but a manifestation of spiritual imbalance that required specialized intervention. The treatment process would be intensive and could take several weeks or even months to complete successfully. However, Father Bergmann explained with apparent reluctance, the healing process required absolute isolation from outside influences. Family members, friends, and even other medical professionals could not be permitted to visit patients during the critical initial treatment phase, as any disruption to the delicate balance of spiritual and medical intervention could not only compromise the healing process, but potentially cause permanent harm to the patient's soul as well as their body. This isolation policy, he assured Klaus, was based on the most advanced medical knowledge available and had been proven effective in hospitals across Europe. Klaus felt every instinct in his body screaming that something was wrong with this arrangement. The idea of leaving his wife in the care of strangers, unable to see her or even receive word of her condition for weeks or months, went against everything he believed about love and marriage. But Father Bergmann's persuasive explanation about the scientific necessity of complete isolation, combined with Sarah's desperate condition and Klaus's lack of any alternative option, eventually convinced him to agree to the hospital's terms. As Klaus walked away from St. Catherine's Hospital that March morning, leading the empty cart that had brought his wife to what he hoped would be her salvation, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was making the worst mistake of his life. The building loomed behind him on its hilltop like a massive tombstone, its narrow windows reflecting the pale winter sun like dead eyes. The silence that surrounded the property was complete and unnatural. No sounds of medical activity, no voices of staff or patients, nothing but the whisper of wind through the bare trees that surrounded the estate. The first indication that something was terribly wrong at St. Catherine's Hospital came exactly 6 weeks after Sarah Hoffman's admission. Klaus had been visiting Father Kessler regularly, sometimes daily, seeking any word about his wife's condition. The elderly priest had been making his own inquiries to Father Bergmann, but each time he approached the hospital, he was turned away with increasingly vague assurances that Sarah was responding well to the innovative treatment protocols and must not be disturbed during this absolutely critical phase of spiritual and physical restoration. Father Kessler himself had begun to feel uneasy about the situation. In his 40 years of ministry, he had never encountered a medical facility that operated with such complete secrecy. His requests to visit the hospital as a priest to offer spiritual comfort to the patients were politely but firmly declined. Father Bergmann explained that his treatment methodology incorporated spiritual healing as an integral component, making outside religious intervention not just unnecessary, but potentially harmful to the carefully calibrated therapeutic environment he had created. The breaking point came on the night of April 15, 1840, when Klaus Hoffmann was awakened by frantic pounding on his door. His neighbor, Wilhelm Brenner, a fellow miner whose shift in the deepest shafts ended at midnight, stood on the doorstep in a state of barely controlled panic. Wilhelm was not a man given to flights of fancy. His years underground had taught him to distinguish between reality and the tricks that darkness and exhaustion could play on a man's mind. What he had witnessed as he walked home along the creek road below the hospital had shaken him to his core. "Klaus," Wilhelm whispered urgently, glancing over his shoulder as if he expected to be overheard. "I swear by all the saints and by the souls of my dead parents, I saw something tonight that no Christian man should ever have to see." According to Wilhelm's account, he had been walking the familiar path home when movement near the hospital's basement entrance caught his attention. 2 figures in dark robes had emerged from the building, moving with practiced efficiency as they carried what appeared to be a human form, wrapped in white cloth. The bundle was too small to be an adult, Wilhelm said, but it was unmistakably shaped like a person. The robed figures had loaded their burden into a horse-drawn cart and disappeared into the dense woods behind the hospital, following what appeared to be a well-worn path that Wilhelm had never noticed before. "But Klaus," Wilhelm continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, "there was something else. As they passed below where I was standing, the wind shifted, and I caught a smell that, God forgive me, it was like meat that's been left too long in the sun, but worse, sweeter, like flowers left too long in a tomb." The 2 men, joined by several other concerned husbands and fathers from the community, made their way to St. Catherine's Hospital at dawn. They found Father Bergmann in the main hall, seated in an ornate chair that seemed more like a throne than conventional furniture. He was calmly reading from a leather-bound book that was written in a script none of them recognized. Not German, not Latin, not any language they had ever encountered. When Klaus demanded to see his wife, to speak with her, or at least to receive some concrete information about her condition, Father Bergmann's demeanor underwent a dramatic transformation. The cultured, reassuring physician who had convinced Klaus to entrust his wife to the hospital's care vanished, replaced by something cold and threatening. The priest's pale face flushed with what appeared to be genuine anger, and his voice dropped to a menacing whisper that seemed to echo strangely in the hospital's main hall. "Your wife is in the most delicate stage of her treatment," Father Bergmann said, his gray eyes seeming to grow darker as he spoke. "Any disturbance now would not only kill her body, but damn her immortal soul to eternal suffering beyond anything you can imagine. Is that what you want, Klaus?" To be responsible for your wife's eternal damnation because you couldn't control your earthly concerns and trust in the Lord's work. The men left the hospital shaken by more than just Father Bergmann's words. There had been something in his presence, in the way the air itself seemed to grow colder when he spoke, that made them feel like they were in the presence of something that wasn't entirely human. But Klaus couldn't sleep that night or any night that followed. His love for Sarah and his growing certainty that she was in terrible danger drove him to take risks that his rational mind knew were dangerous. 3 nights after the confrontation at the hospital, Klaus crept back to the estate under cover of darkness. He had spent days studying the building's layout and the routines of its inhabitants, looking for any opportunity to catch a glimpse of what was really happening inside. The hospital's isolation, which Father Bergmann claimed was essential for his treatment methods, also meant that Klaus could approach the building without being observed by anyone from town. Using skills he had learned during his childhood in the mountains of Bavaria, Klaus climbed an ancient oak tree that grew close enough to the hospital's 3rd floor to allow him to peer into one of the narrow windows. What he saw in that candle-lit room would haunt him for the rest of his life, and would eventually drive him to actions that would save dozens of lives while destroying his own peace of mind forever. The room was illuminated by dozens of candles, arranged in a complex geometric pattern that Klaus didn't recognize, but that filled him with an instinctive dread. In the center of the pattern lay a figure on a table, naked, motionless, and so emaciated that Klaus couldn't immediately tell if it was his wife or even if it was still alive. The body was covered with strange markings that appeared to have been carved or burned into the skin, creating patterns that seemed to writhe and shift in the flickering candlelight. Father Bergmann stood over the body, his hands moving in ritualistic gestures, while he chanted in that unknown language Klaus had heard him reading from earlier. But what was most disturbing were the other figures in the room. At least 6 people in religious robes, their faces hidden by deep hoods surrounding the table like mourners at a funeral or participants in some ancient ceremony. The atmosphere in the room was thick with something that went beyond religious solemnity. There was an energy there that felt predatory and hungry. As Klaus watched in growing horror, one of the robed figures approached the table with what appeared to be a medical instrument, but one that had been modified in ways that made its purpose unclear. The implement seemed designed more for ritual than for healing, with intricate engravings and additional components that transformed it into something that belonged more in an ancient temple than in a modern medical facility. Klaus fell from the tree in his shock and terror, breaking his arm in the process and creating enough noise to alert the hospital's inhabitants to his presence. As he fled through the forest, he could hear sounds of pursuit behind him. Not the voices of concerned medical staff, but something else entirely. The sounds that followed him through the darkness were like nothing he had ever heard before. A combination of human voices and something that seemed to come from throats that were not entirely human. When Klaus returned to town, his arm hanging useless at his side and his mind reeling from what he had witnessed, the community was divided in their response to his account. Some believed him immediately, recognizing in his terror and trauma the signs of a man who had seen something beyond the boundaries of normal human experience. Others thought that grief and worry had finally driven him over the edge into madness, that his love for Sarah had caused him to imagine horrors that existed only in his own tortured mind. But everyone agreed on one thing. Something had to be done to discover the truth about what was happening at St. Catherine's Hospital. The question was whether they had the courage to face whatever that truth might be. Father Johann Kessler had lived through enough years and seen enough of human nature to recognize when evil was hiding behind a mask of righteousness. Despite his advanced age and typically submissive nature when dealing with church hierarchy, the elderly priest made a decision that would define the rest of his life and ultimately save the lives of dozens of innocent people. 4 days after Klaus Hoffmann's terrifying report from the hospital, Father Kessler rode up the winding road to St. Catherine's, with the full authority of the church behind him and a determination to discover the truth, regardless of the personal cost. The confrontation between the two priests took place in the hospital's main hall, but it was unlike any theological discussion that either man had ever experienced. Father Bergmann's reaction to Father Kessler's demand for access to inspect the facility was swift, brutal, and revealing. Rather than the cooperation and transparency that would be expected from one priest to another, Father Bergmann immediately went on the attack, accusing the elderly priest of heresy, of interfering with God's work, and of lacking the faith and intellectual sophistication necessary to understand what he called the higher mysteries of divine healing. "You dare question methods that have been blessed by Rome itself?" Bergmann hissed, his cultured accent becoming more pronounced as his agitation increased. He produced a series of official-looking documents with elaborate seals and ribbons, spreading them across a table with the confidence of a man who had never had his authority questioned. "These treatments have saved souls across Europe, Father Kessler. Would you deny the suffering people of this community their only hope of salvation because of your provincial suspicions and limited understanding?" But Father Kessler's decades of experience in dealing with both genuine saints and clever sinners had taught him to look beyond impressive credentials and smooth words. He noticed details that others had missed. The way Father Bergmann's hands trembled slightly when he spoke of Rome, despite his confident tone. The fact that his official documents were written in Latin that contained subtle grammatical errors that no genuine church scholar would have made. Most disturbing of all was the smell that seemed to permeate the entire building, a sweet and cloying odor that was unlike anything Father Kessler had ever encountered in a hospital or medical facility. The smell was not the clean scent of carbolic acid and soap that characterized legitimate hospitals, nor was it the familiar mixture of medicine and human suffering that he had experienced during his visits to the hospital in Pittsburgh. Instead, there was something organic and corrupt about the odor. Something that reminded him of the flowers that mourners placed on graves after the bodies beneath had been in the ground too long. It was a smell that seemed to cling to everything in the building, including Father Bergmann himself. During their increasingly heated exchange, Father Kessler made a series of demands that would expose the true nature of Father Bergmann's operation. He insisted on seeing the hospital's patient records, the treatment logs that should document each patient's progress, and most importantly, the discharge papers for patients who had been successfully cured and released. Father Bergmann's response to these reasonable requests was both telling and terrifying. The younger priest claimed that such records were sacred documents that contained medical and spiritual information too sensitive to be reviewed by anyone lacking the proper theological and medical training. He insisted that Father Kessler's spiritual immaturity and limited understanding of the divine mysteries made him unworthy of access to such knowledge. Furthermore, he claimed that the very act of demanding to see these records demonstrated a lack of faith that was bordering on blasphemy. Father Kessler left the hospital that day with a growing certainty that something profoundly evil had taken root in his parish, but he also realized that exposing and stopping Father Bergmann would require more than just suspicion and moral outrage. He would need evidence, documentation, and testimony that would be convincing enough to overcome the younger priest's apparent connections to church authorities and his obvious financial resources. The elderly priest began his own investigation with the methodical thoroughness that had served him well in 40 years of ministry. He quietly visited every family in the community that had entrusted a loved one to St. Catherine's Hospital, conducting what he described as pastoral visits, while actually gathering information about the circumstances surrounding each patient's admission and the family's subsequent contact, or lack thereof, with the hospital. What Father Kessler discovered was a pattern of behavior that was both consistent and deeply disturbing. In every single case, the patient had been admitted to the hospital with conditions that, while serious, were not typically fatal. Broken bones from mining accidents, respiratory ailments that were common in the dusty environment of the coal industry, infections that should have responded to conventional treatment, None of these conditions should have resulted in death if proper medical care had been provided. More troubling still was the discovery that the hospital's isolation policy was not just strictly enforced, but was accompanied by a complete cessation of communication between the hospital and the patients' families. Unlike legitimate medical facilities, which provided regular updates on patients' conditions and allowed for emergency visits in cases of deterioration, St. Catherine's Hospital maintained absolute silence from the moment a patient was admitted until the family was eventually informed of their death. The most damning evidence came when Father Kessler began to notice that personal effects belonging to deceased patients, wedding rings, family heirlooms, religious medals, and other items of both monetary and sentimental value had somehow found their way into the possession of Father Bergmann's most devoted followers. When questioned about these items, the hospital's staff and supporters claimed they were blessed gifts from Father Bergmann, tokens of his appreciation for their service to the hospital and their commitment to his revolutionary healing methods. Father Kessler's investigation also revealed financial irregularities that painted an even darker picture of the hospital's operations. St. Catherine's was receiving substantial payments from the families of patients, money that was supposed to cover medical treatments, medications, and the cost of extended care. However, when the priest discreetly investigated the hospital's supply purchases and staffing expenses, he found no corresponding expenditures for medicine, medical equipment, or the supplies that would be necessary to treat the number of patients the hospital claimed to be caring for. The money that families paid for their loved ones' treatment was simply disappearing, flowing into accounts that Father Bergmann controlled with no oversight from church authorities or civil officials. The priest was essentially collecting payment for medical services that were never provided, while the patients themselves were subjected to something far different from conventional medical treatment. Perhaps most disturbing of all was Father Kessler's discovery that several recent admissions to the hospital had not been people who were actually ill. These individuals, primarily young women from the poorest families in the community, had been convinced by Father Bergmann's followers that they were showing early signs of serious illness and needed immediate preventive treatment. The priest's network of devoted supporters had become recruiting agents, identifying vulnerable individuals who could be brought to the hospital under the guise of medical necessity. These healthy individuals had been targeted not because they were sick, but because they possessed certain characteristics that Father Bergmann seemed to value. They were typically young, physically healthy despite their poverty, and came from families that would be unlikely to cause trouble if they disappeared. The pattern suggested that Father Bergmann was not simply taking advantage of people who were already ill, but was actively seeking out specific types of individuals for purposes that had nothing to do with legitimate medical treatment. As winter approached in 1840, Father Kessler compiled his evidence and prepared a detailed report that he intended to send to Bishop Michael O'Connor in Pittsburgh. But as he worked on his documentation, he became increasingly aware that Father Bergmann's network of followers was more extensive than he had initially realized, and that his own investigation had not gone unnoticed by the hospital's supporters. Strange incidents began occurring around Father Kessler's modest church and rectory. He would find evidence that someone had been searching through his papers when he was away from the building. His mail was being intercepted and delayed, making it difficult for him to communicate with church authorities in Pittsburgh. Most unsettling of all, he began to notice that he was being watched by individuals who claimed to be concerned parishioners, but who asked questions that seemed designed to determine how much he knew about the hospital's operations. The elderly priest realized that his life was in danger, but he also understood that he might be the only person in a position to expose the truth about St. Catherine's Hospital and save the lives of the people who were trapped within its walls. The question was whether he would live long enough to get his evidence to authorities who had the power to take action against Father Bergmann and his increasingly dangerous operation. The breakthrough in Father Kessler's investigation came from an entirely unexpected source. On a bitter December evening in 1840, as snow fell heavily outside his modest rectory, the elderly priest was interrupted by desperate knocking at his door. When he opened it, he found Margaret Dutton, a young woman from the community whose husband Thomas had been admitted to St. Catherine's Hospital 2 months earlier with what should have been a treatable broken leg from a mining accident. Margaret was in a state of near hysteria that went far beyond normal grief or worry. Her clothes were torn and muddy, her feet were cut and bleeding as if she had been running through the forest barefoot, and her normally neat brown hair had been partially shaved in a pattern that was unlike anything Father Kessler had ever seen. Most disturbing of all, her wrists bore clear marks from rope bindings, and her eyes held the haunted look of someone who had experienced horrors that challenged her very sanity. Her story was so incredible that Father Kessler initially questioned whether trauma and grief had driven her into a state of delusion. But the physical evidence of her ordeal was undeniable, and as she spoke, details emerged that corroborated information he had gathered during his own investigation. Margaret claimed that she had just escaped from St. Catherine's Hospital, where she had been held prisoner for 3 days and subjected to treatment that had nothing to do with medical care and everything to do with something far more sinister. According to Margaret's account, her ordeal had begun when she was approached by Martha Steinberg, one of Father Bergmann's most devoted followers, and a woman who had donated substantial amounts of money to support the hospital's operations. Martha had told Margaret that Thomas was asking for her, that his condition had taken a turn for the worse, and that Father Bergmann had decided to make an exception to the hospital's no-visitor policy due to her husband's desperate state. Overwhelmed with relief and hope, Margaret had accompanied Martha to the hospital without question. She had been so focused on the possibility of seeing Thomas again that she hadn't noticed the strangeness of being led not to the main entrance but to a side door that opened directly into the hospital's basement level. By the time she realized that something was wrong, it was too late to escape. For 3 days, Margaret had been kept in a small, windowless room in the hospital's basement, fed only bread and water, and subjected to what Father Bergmann called preparatory examinations. The priest had questioned her extensively about her family history, her religious beliefs, her dreams and fears, and most strangely, about any unusual experiences she might have had, visions, prophetic dreams, encounters with what he termed spiritual entities. Father Bergmann's questioning had been accompanied by physical examinations that went far beyond anything that could be justified by medical necessity. He had measured various parts of her body with instruments that seemed designed for purposes other than conventional medicine, taken samples of her hair and blood, and subjected her to tests that involved her reactions to various religious symbols, texts in unknown languages, and substances that produced strange effects on her perception and consciousness. He kept asking me about signs and portents, Margaret told Father Kessler, her voice shaking with the memory. He wanted to know if I had seen lights in the sky, if I had heard voices that others couldn't hear, if I had experienced any supernatural encounters. When I told him that I was just a simple woman who loved her husband and wanted to see him, he became angry. He said I was unsuitable for the greater work and that I would be disposed of in the morning. Margaret's escape had been possible only because of a mistake by one of her captors, and the chaos that resulted from what she could only describe as an incident in the deeper levels of the hospital's basement. During her final night of imprisonment, she had heard screaming from somewhere below her cell, sounds that she described as not quite human, but not quite animal either. The sounds had been accompanied by what she could only describe as a terrible commotion, with running footsteps, shouted orders in that unknown language she had heard Father Bergmann speaking, and the sounds of what might have been medical equipment being moved rapidly. The guard who was supposed to be watching Margaret's cell had abandoned his post to deal with whatever emergency was occurring in the hospital's lower levels, allowing her to slip away through a basement window that had been left unbarred. Her escape through the dense forest in the middle of a snowstorm, running barefoot and wearing only the thin dress she had been given to replace her own clothes, had been a nightmare of cold, pain, and terror. But her fear of what would happen if she was recaptured had driven her to keep moving until she reached Father Kessler's door. Most chilling of all was Margaret's account of what she had glimpsed during her brief time in the hospital's basement level. She described rooms that bore no resemblance to any medical facility she had ever imagined, chambers filled with equipment that seemed designed more for torture than healing, walls covered with symbols and texts in languages that hurt her eyes to look at, and most disturbing of all, a series of cells that contained what she could only describe as people who had been there too long. These individuals, Margaret said, were clearly alive, but had been changed by their experiences in ways that made them barely recognizable as human beings. They moved strangely, spoke in whispers, or not at all, and seemed to be existing in a state that was neither fully alive nor completely dead. Some bore physical modifications that suggested they had been subjected to procedures that went far beyond conventional medicine, while others seemed to have been changed in ways that were more psychological than physical, but were equally disturbing. Father Kessler realized immediately that Margaret's escape had likely sealed both of their fates. If her account was accurate, then Father Bergmann's operation was far more extensive and dangerous than even his worst suspicions had suggested. The priest was not simply defrauding families and allowing patients to die from neglect. He was conducting experiments on human beings, using his position as a medical authority and religious figure to acquire subjects for research that challenged the very boundaries of what it meant to be human. The elderly priest made a decision that would determine whether they would live to expose the truth or disappear like so many others who had threatened Father Bergmann's work. They would leave for Pittsburgh immediately, taking with them all the evidence he had gathered and Margaret's first-hand testimony about what was happening in the hospital's basement. It was their only chance of survival and the only hope for the people who were still trapped within St. Catherine's walls. But as they prepared for their desperate escape, Father Kessler received word that would make their journey even more urgent and dangerous. The Müller family, despite his earlier warnings to the community, had decided to bring their daughter Anna to the hospital for treatment of what they believed was a serious fever. By the time Father Kessler learned of their decision, 12-year-old Anna Müller had already been admitted to St. Catherine's Hospital, and her parents had been told that she would need several weeks of intensive treatment before they could see her again. The journey to Pittsburgh through the harsh Pennsylvania winter became a desperate race against time and against the growing certainty that Father Bergmann's network of followers was pursuing them. Father Kessler and Margaret traveled by night, hiding during the day in barns and abandoned buildings, constantly looking over their shoulders for signs of the riders who seemed to be tracking their movements through the snow-covered countryside. The priest had underestimated the extent of Father Bergmann's influence throughout the region. What he had assumed was a localized operation centered around the hospital proved to be part of a much larger network that extended across multiple counties. Supporters of the hospital were not confined to Bradenville, but were spread throughout western Pennsylvania, watching the roads and reporting on anyone who might pose a threat to Father Bergmann's work. On their second night of travel, as they sheltered in an abandoned mill near the town of Greensburg, Father Kessler and Margaret heard the sounds of horses approaching through the darkness. The riders called out in what sounded like German, but it was a dialect that the priest didn't recognize. Older, harsher, with inflections that seemed to come from a time and place far removed from modern Bavaria. The searchers spent hours combing through the area around the mill, coming close enough that Margaret could hear their breathing and the jingle of their horses' harnesses. What saved them was Margaret's knowledge of the countryside, gained during her childhood in the region before her marriage to Thomas. She led Father Kessler through a series of caves that honeycombed the hills around Greensburg, natural formations that had been used by local children for generations as hiding places and adventure playgrounds. The caves were cold and treacherous in winter, but they provided concealment that no pursuer could penetrate without intimate knowledge of their layout. As they huddled in the darkness of the limestone caves, listening to the sounds of their pursuers searching above them, Margaret revealed additional details about her captivity that she had been too traumatized to share earlier. The basement of St. Catherine's Hospital, she explained, was far more extensive than the building's exterior suggested. The chambers where she had been held were only the uppermost level of a complex that extended deep into the hillside, with multiple levels connected by stone stairways that seemed to have been carved directly from the living rock. During her 3 days of imprisonment, Margaret had heard sounds from the lower levels that suggested activities taking place far below ground. Machinery operating, voices engaged in what sounded like complex procedures, and most disturbing of all, sounds that suggested the presence of far more people in the hospital's depths than could be accounted for by the known patient admissions. Father Bergmann's operation was not simply larger than they had suspected. It was older, more established, and involved procedures that had been going on for far longer than the 8 years since the hospital's official opening. Margaret also revealed that during her interrogations, Father Bergmann had made references to previous facilities and earlier work that suggested St. Catherine's Hospital was not his first attempt at this type of operation. He had spoken of methods that had been perfected over decades and had referred to colleagues and supporters who had been working with him since the old country. The implication was that Father Bergmann's activities had begun long before his arrival in Pennsylvania, and that the hospital was part of a larger organization with resources and influence that extended far beyond what a single corrupt priest could command. When they finally reached Pittsburgh after 4 days of dangerous travel, Father Kessler and Margaret discovered that their ordeal was far from over. Bishop Michael O'Connor's response to their evidence and testimony was not the immediate action they had expected, but rather a careful evaluation that seemed more concerned with protecting the church's reputation than with stopping Father Bergmann's activities. The bishop listened to their account with what appeared to be growing alarm, but his questions focused not on the welfare of the patients at St. Catherine's, but on the potential scandal that would result if the story became public knowledge. He seemed particularly concerned about the implications for the Catholic Church's reputation among the Protestant majority in Pennsylvania, and about the potential legal and financial consequences that might result from a public investigation into the hospital's activities. "You understand?" Bishop O'Connor said carefully, choosing his words with the precision of a man who had spent decades navigating the complex politics of church hierarchy, that accusations of this nature against a priest require the highest level of proof. The church cannot act on rumors and speculation, no matter how well-intentioned. We must proceed with extreme caution to avoid damaging the reputation of the church itself, which serves thousands of faithful Catholics throughout this region. Father Kessler realized with growing horror that the church hierarchy was more concerned with institutional preservation than with stopping what amounted to systematic murder and torture being conducted under the cover of religious authority. The bishop's response made it clear that any investigation would be conducted with the primary goal of minimizing damage to the church, rather than rescuing the victims of Father Bergmann's experiments. The elderly priest and Margaret were housed in a Pittsburgh convent under what amounted to protective custody, but it quickly became apparent that they were prisoners rather than guests. They were not permitted to leave the convent grounds, their mail was monitored, and their contact with the outside world was strictly controlled. Bishop O'Connor claimed that these measures were necessary for their own protection, but Father Kessler suspected that the real purpose was to prevent them from taking their story to secular authorities or to the press. During their weeks of enforced isolation, Father Kessler began to suspect that the corruption extended far beyond Father Bergmann's individual operation. Strange visitors came to meet with Bishop O'Connor, men in expensive clothes who spoke in hushed tones about containing the situation and protecting the church's interests. These individuals showed no concern for the welfare of the patients at St. Catherine's and seemed primarily focused on ensuring that no word of the scandal reached the public or the civil authorities. The conversations that Father Kessler overheard suggested that similar operations existed in other locations, that Father Bergmann was part of a network of individuals who used religious authority as cover for activities that challenged the very foundations of medical ethics and human decency. References were made to other facilities and ongoing research that indicated St. Catherine's Hospital was not an isolated case, but part of a larger conspiracy that operated with the knowledge and protection of highly placed church officials. Margaret, meanwhile, was struggling with psychological trauma that was compounded by the realization that her husband, Thomas, was still trapped in the hospital and that no rescue was being planned. Her nightmares had become so vivid and specific that Father Kessler wondered if they might be memories rather than dreams. Detailed visions of underground chambers, of procedures that seemed to blur the line between medicine and torture, and of a growing certainty that Thomas was not simply dead, but had been subjected to something far worse than death. The breakthrough came when Sister Catherine Morrison, one of the nuns at the convent where they were staying, revealed that she had been eavesdropping on conversations between Bishop O'Connor and his mysterious visitors. What she had overheard convinced her that the church was planning to transfer Father Bergmann to another location where he could continue his work without the scrutiny that had developed in Pennsylvania. Sister Morrison had discovered references to a network of similar facilities operating under church protection in remote areas across the United States. Locations where individuals like Father Bergmann could continue their research without interference from civil authorities or public oversight. The plan apparently was to quietly close St. Catherine's Hospital, dispose of any remaining evidence, and relocate Father Bergmann to a new facility where he could resume his activities under a different identity. The revelation that St. Catherine's was not an isolated case, but part of a larger conspiracy, convinced Father Kessler that waiting for official church action was not an option. The evidence suggested that similar atrocities were being committed in multiple locations, that the victims numbered in the hundreds or possibly thousands, and that the church hierarchy was not only aware of these activities, but was actively protecting and facilitating them. Father Kessler began planning an escape from the convent, knowing that their only hope of stopping Father Bergmann and exposing the larger conspiracy was to take their evidence directly to secular authorities who would not be influenced by church politics. But he also knew that such action would mark them as enemies of one of the most powerful institutions in America, with consequences that could extend far beyond their own lives. The plan required careful timing and the cooperation of Sister Morrison, who had access to areas of the convent that were off-limits to Father Kessler and Margaret. The nun had been documenting the conversation she overheard, creating a record of the conspiracy that extended far beyond the activities at St. Catherine's Hospital. Her evidence included names, locations, and details about the network of facilities that operated under church protection across the United States. But Father Bergmann's network was more extensive and better organized than they had realized. On the night before their planned escape, Father Kessler was awakened by Sister Morrison, who warned him that armed men had been seen watching the convent and asking questions about the guests who were staying there. The elderly priest realized that they were no longer simply prisoners of the church hierarchy, but were now actively hunted by forces that would stop at nothing to protect their secrets. The escape from the Pittsburgh convent became a desperate flight through the snow-covered streets of the city, with Father Kessler, Margaret, and Sister Morrison making their way toward the newspaper offices where Father Kessler hoped to find editors willing to publish their story. But as they moved through the darkness, they became aware that they were being followed by riders whose purpose was clearly not to recapture them, but to ensure that they never had the opportunity to tell their story to anyone. The confrontation that would determine the fate of everyone involved in the St. Catherine's conspiracy took place not in the safety of a newspaper office or courthouse, but in the abandoned warehouse district along Pittsburgh's Monongahela River. Father Kessler, Margaret, and Sister Morrison had been forced to take refuge in a derelict building when it became clear that their pursuers had anticipated their route to the newspaper offices and were waiting to intercept them. As dawn broke over the industrial landscape of Pittsburgh, the three fugitives found themselves surrounded by more than a dozen men whose appearance and behavior suggested they were far more than simple church officials or hospital employees. These individuals moved with military precision, wore clothes that marked them as wealthy and educated, and spoke among themselves in that same unknown language that Father Kessler had heard Father Bergmann using during his rituals. The leader of their pursuers was a man who introduced himself as Dr. Friedrich von Reichenbach, claiming to represent interests that extend far beyond the simple concerns of a rural hospital. Dr. von Reichenbach was an elderly man whose bearing and education were immediately apparent, but whose eyes held the same cold intensity that Father Kessler had seen in Father Bergmann. He spoke with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question, and his knowledge of the details of their investigation made it clear that their activities had been monitored far more closely than they had realized. "Father Kessler, Doctor," von Reichenbach said, in accented English that suggested German origins but education in multiple countries. "You have stumbled into matters that are far beyond your understanding or your authority to interfere with. The work being done at St. Catherine's Hospital represents advances in medical knowledge that will benefit humanity for generations to come. Your provincial concerns about individual suffering are preventing progress that could eliminate human suffering entirely." The conversation that followed revealed the true scope and purpose of the conspiracy that Father Kessler had uncovered. St. Catherine's Hospital was indeed part of a network of facilities, but the network was far larger and more international than he had suspected. Dr. von Reichenbach spoke of research that had been ongoing for decades, involving collaboration between medical researchers, religious institutions, and government officials across Europe and America. The patients at St. Catherine's, according to Dr. von Reichenbach, were not simply victims of medical experimentation, but were voluntary participants in research that was pushing the boundaries of human knowledge. The procedures that Margaret had witnessed were not torture, but advanced medical techniques that were exploring the connections between physical and spiritual existence. The deaths that had occurred were unfortunate but necessary sacrifices in service of discoveries that would ultimately save countless lives. Father Kessler's response to these revelations was immediate and uncompromising. He recognized the language of rationalization that had been used throughout history to justify atrocities. The claim that individual suffering was acceptable in service of some greater good. But more than that, he understood that the conspiracy he had uncovered represented a fundamental corruption of everything that medical practice and religious faith were supposed to represent. "You speak of voluntary participation," Father Kessler said, his voice carrying the authority of 40 years of ministry. "But these people were deceived about the nature of your work. You speak of advancing medical knowledge, but you hide your activities from legitimate medical institutions. You claim to serve humanity, but you prey on the most vulnerable members of society. Whatever knowledge you have gained through these methods is corrupted by the evil of how it was obtained." The confrontation escalated when Dr. von Reichenbach revealed that Father Bergmann's work at St. Catherine's was nearing completion of what he called the final phase, a series of procedures that would demonstrate the full potential of their research methods. This final phase apparently involved the remaining patients at the hospital, including Anna Müller and any other individuals who had been admitted since Father Kessler's escape from Bradenville. Margaret's reaction to this news was immediate and visceral. Her husband Thomas was among those remaining patients, and the possibility that he was about to be subjected to whatever constituted Father Bergmann's final phase drove her to a desperation that overcame her fear. She began demanding immediate action to rescue the remaining patients, regardless of the personal cost or the political implications. Sister Morrison, meanwhile, had been quietly observing their captors and had noticed details that suggested the situation was even more dangerous than it appeared. Several of the men who had surrounded them were carrying medical instruments that had been modified in ways that suggested their intended use was not healing, but something far more sinister. The implication was that if they could not be convinced to remain silent about what they had discovered, they would be silenced permanently. The turning point came when Dr. von Reichenbach made an offer that revealed both the extent of the conspiracy's resources and their desperation to prevent exposure. He proposed that Father Kessler, Margaret, and Sister Morrison could be relocated to Europe, given new identities, and provided with substantial financial compensation in exchange for their silence about the activities at St. Catherine's Hospital. The offer included guarantees that no further patients would be harmed and that the facility would be closed within a reasonable time period. Father Kessler's rejection of this offer was immediate and absolute. He recognized it as an attempt to buy their silence while allowing the conspiracy to continue operating in other locations. More importantly, he understood that accepting such an arrangement would make him complicit in the suffering of every future victim of the network's activities. "There is no compromise possible with evil," Father Kessler declared, his voice carrying the conviction of a man who had found his purpose. "No amount of money or personal safety can justify allowing this corruption to continue. If you kill us here, our deaths will only serve to prove the truth of what we have discovered. If you let us live, we will spend every remaining day of our lives exposing your activities and rescuing your victims." The standoff in the Pittsburgh warehouse was broken by an intervention that none of the participants had anticipated. As Dr. von Reichenbach and his associates debated what to do with their captives, the sound of approaching horses and shouted orders in English indicated that secular authorities had somehow learned of the confrontation and were moving to intervene. The arrival of a combined force of federal marshals and Pennsylvania state militia transformed the situation completely. Leading the authorities was Federal Marshal James Patterson, who had been investigating reports of suspicious activities at religious institutions across western Pennsylvania as part of a broader federal inquiry into what government officials termed irregular medical practices in remote areas. Marshal Patterson's investigation had been prompted not by Father Kessler's evidence, which had been suppressed by church authorities, but by reports from other sources that suggested a pattern of disappearances and suspicious deaths associated with certain medical facilities operated under religious auspices. The federal government had received complaints from families in multiple states about loved ones who had disappeared after being admitted to isolated hospitals and sanitariums that claimed to offer revolutionary treatments. The intervention of federal authorities revealed that the St. Catherine's conspiracy was even larger than Father Kessler had suspected, but it also demonstrated that the network's activities had not gone completely unnoticed by secular law enforcement. Dr. von Reichenbach and his associates found themselves facing not just the exposure of their activities, but criminal charges that could result in imprisonment or execution. The confrontation that followed was less a battle than a revelation of the true scope of corruption that had enabled Father Bergmann's activities to continue for so long. Dr. von Reichenbach's attempts to claim diplomatic immunity and church protection were met by Marshal Patterson's presentation of evidence that the conspiracy involved violations of federal law, international treaties, and basic standards of human decency that superseded any religious or political protections. But the most shocking revelation came when Dr.